April 7, 1945, Tokyo Bay, Japan. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai pressed his eyes against his gun sight as he watched something that violated everything Hick knew about aerial warfare. American fighter aircraft circled high above Tokyo at 25,000 ft over 700 meters from any known American base. Single-engine fighters, not the twin-tailed lightnings that occasionally made the impossible journey. These were different, sleeker, faster, and they were everywhere. "This cannot be happening," he muttered into his oxygen mask, his breath condensing in the frigid air of his Mitsubishi Zero's cockpit. For 3 years, Japanese military planners had assured their pilots that no single-engine American fighter could reach the home islands. The distances were too great, the fuel requirements impossible, the ocean too vast. Yet there they were, 96 silver aircraft with distinctive, bubble canopies escorting a massive formation of B-29 super fortresses directly over the heart of the Japanese Empire. The mathematics of what Sakai witnessed were writing the final chapters of Japanese air superiority. Me from Iwima to Tokyo, round trip off 1,500 meters over open ocean, 8 hours in a cramped cockpit. Fuel consumption that should have been impossible for any fighter in the world. But the American Chad achieved it. The North American P-51 Mustang, powered by the Packard Merlin engine and equipped with revolutionary drop tank technology, had just shattered the last defensive advantage Japan possessed. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots would prove more devastating than any military defeat. Their sanctuary had been breached. The crisis had been building since February 19, 1945, when United States Marines stormed the beaches of Iwima. The volcanic island, barely 8 square miles in area, sat precisely 750 statute miles south of Tokyo. To the Japanese High Command, Iwima was just another island fortress in a shrinking defensive perimeter. To American strategic planners, it was the key that would unlock the skies over Japan. The battle for Iwima lasted 36 days and cost 6,121 American lives with another 19,217 wounded. Nearly all 21,000 Japanese defenders fought to the death. But Havana's Marines were still clearing caves and bunkers. American engineers were expanding the 3 Japanese airfields for a very specific purpose. On March 6, 1945, barely 2 weeks after the initial landings and 10 days before the island was declared secure, the first P-51 Mustangs of the 15th Fighter Group touched down on Iwima's south field. The pilots climbed out of their cockpits and were immediately handed entrenching tools and ordered to dig foxholes. Japanese soldiers were still emerging from caves to launch suicide attacks. The airmen had no tents, no permanent structures, only the volcanic ash and the constant smell of sulfur from Mount Suribachi. They were setting up operations on an active battlefield. Major James Van Diehe, squadron commander of the 78th Fighter Squadron, surveyed the desolate landscape that would be his new home. Black volcanic sand stretched in every direction. The air stank of sulfur and death. Artillery still boomed from the northern end of the island, where Marines were locked in brutal combat. The moment had arrived to prove that American fighters could accomplish what Japanese intelligence deemed impossible. Tokyo lay 750 meters to the north-northwest between Iwima and the Japanese capital stretched nothing but empty Pacific Ocean. The preparation for very long-range missions had begun months earlier. The 7th Fighter Command, nicknamed the Sunsetters, had been training specifically for the challenge of escorting B-29 bombers from Iwima to the Japanese home islands and back. The mission profile was unprecedented in aerial warfare. Pilots would fly for 3 hours across open ocean to reach Japan, spend 30 to 90 minutes in combat over heavily defended targets, then face another 3 hours over water to return home. Total mission time would exceed 8 hours. No rescue ships positioned along the route. No alternate landing fields make it back to Iwo or perish in the Pacific. The aircraft that would make this possible was the P-51 Mustang, arguably the finest fighter aircraft of World War II, with its distinctive Laminina flow wing, efficient cooling system, and powerful Packard Merlin WWII 657 engine producing 1,695 horsepower. The Mustang could reach speeds of 437 mph at altitude, but speed was not its most important attribute for the Pacific War. Range defined everything. The standard P-51 carried 184 gallons of internal fuel in wing tanks. An additional 85 gallons could be carried in a fuselage tank behind the pilot, though this created dangerous center of gravity issues when full. The real breakthrough came with external drop tanks mounted beneath the wings. 210-gallon drop tanks could extend the Mustang's combat radius to over 850 meters. This gave the P-51 a maximum range, approaching 1,600 meters with careful fuel management. Just enough to reach Tokyo from Iwo and return with a reserve for combat and emergency. The drop tank technology was itself a marvel of American engineering. Manufactured from pressed aluminum, these expendable fuel containers could be jettisoned before combat, reducing drag and weight. American factories were producing tens of thousands of drop tanks monthly by 1945. Each one cost approximately $15 to manufacture. For the price of a single fighter aircraft, American industry could produce drop tanks for an entire squadron for months of operations. The Japanese had no equivalent system. Their fighters were designed for shorter range interception missions. Japanese drop tanks were scarce, poorly manufactured, and rarely used. The pilots selected for the Iwo mission were mostly young with minimal P-51 experience. Many had fewer than 10 hours in type before deploying to the volcanic island. They would learn through direct experience or they would not survive. Captain Harry Krim Jr. of the 72nd Fighter Squadron was among the first to land on EWO. At age 23, he was already considered a veteran. The island itself was more dangerous than Japanese forces at first. Japanese soldiers hiding in caves everywhere meant weapons had to be carried constantly. At night, gunfire and grenades echoed across the volcanic landscape. During the day, preparations continued for the longest fighter missions anyone had ever attempted. The first month on Iwo was spent supporting Marines on the island and conducting shorter-range strikes against nearby Chichima, 47 north. These missions allowed pilots to familiarize themselves with overwater navigation, fuel management, and the unique challenges of Pacific operations. The Mustang's Packard Merlin engine proved reliable, but 8-hour missions would push everything to its limits. Spark plugs fouled easily. Oil consumption had to be monitored constantly. The slightest mechanical issue could mean death in the Pacific. Ground crews worked 18-hour days in brutal conditions, maintaining aircraft in open airfields with minimal equipment and supplies. By early April 1945, 3 fighter groups were operational on Iwo. The 15th Fighter Group, the 21st Fighter Group, and later the 56th Fighter Group together could put over 100 Mustangs in the air for major missions. The stage was set for the most challenging fighter operations of the Pacific War. Tokyo was 750 mi away. 750 mi of empty ocean. 750 mi that Japanese military planners had believed made their home islands invulnerable to American fighters. That assumption was about to be shattered beyond repair. On April 6, 1945, pilots attended their briefing for the first very long-range escort mission to Tokyo. The tension in the operations tent was palpable. Major Van Hee spread maps across a makeshift table and announced they would make history the following day by flying to Tokyo. The room erupted in nervous chatter as pilots studied maps, calculated fuel consumption, and checked weather forecasts. The route was straightforward on paper, but potentially fatal in execution. Fly north and northwest for approximately 3 hours at 10,000 ft. Maintain formation discipline. Conserve fuel meticulously. Link up with B-29s from the 73rd Bomb Wing approximately 20 miles south of Tokyo. Escort the bombers over their targets. Engage enemy fighters. Fight back home. The briefing continued with brutal honesty about the realities facing them. This was a 1,500-minute round trip. Pilots would be in cockpits for 8 hours minimum. There were no alternate landing sites. If mechanical problems developed, pilots would go down in the Pacific. Search and rescue would attempt recovery. But thousands of square miles of ocean made successful rescue uncertain at best. Pilots needed to make it back to WWII. That meant managing fuel like their lives depended on it because survival absolutely depended on fuel management. Every ounce of fuel mattered. Every decision counted. Instruments required constant monitoring. Smooth flying was essential. No aggressive maneuvers until drop tanks were jettisoned. Separation from formation could prove fatal because navigation over water was completely different than over land. There were no landmarks to guide lost aircraft, just endless ocean. Maintenance crews worked through the night of April 6th, preparing 96 P-51 Mustangs for the historic mission. Each aircraft was meticulously inspected. Engines were tuned to perfection. Fuel systems were checked and rechecked multiple times. The 110-gallon drop tanks were filled and mounted beneath each wing. The fuselage tanks were topped off. Gun bays were loaded with 1,880 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition. Oxygen systems were tested thoroughly. Every detail mattered because a single mechanical failure could mean the difference between life and death. For the pilot, April 7, 1945 dawned clear and cold over WWII. At 0700 hours, pilots began their pre-flight routines. They dressed in layers, knowing temperatures would approach. 40° F at altitude, flight suits, Mae West life preservers, parachutes, survival kits. Each pilot carried emergency rations, water, signal flares, and shark repellent. Chances of survival if going down in the Pacific were slim, but preparation might make the crucial difference between life and death. At 0745 hours, engines began coughing to life across all 3 Iwo Jima airfields. The Packard Merlin's distinctive sound echoed across the volcanic island. Pilots performed final instrument checks. Fuel gauges reading full. Oxygen flow confirmed. Radio check completed successfully. Drop tanks secure and properly mounted. Gun sight activated. Trim tabs set to appropriate positions. The moment had arrived. At 0800 hours precisely, the first flight of 4 P-51Ds rolled down Southfield's runway and lifted into the morning sky. Within 20 minutes, 96 Mustangs were airborne, forming up into flights of 4, squadrons of 16, groups of 48. The Armada turned north-northwest and set course for Tokyo. The journey to Tokyo tested every aspect of pilot skill and aircraft capability. Flying in tight formation for 3 hours required constant concentration. The slightest deviation in throttle position affected fuel consumption significantly. Pilots had to maintain precise altitude, airspeed, and position continuously. At 10,000 ft, they climbed on oxygen, watching gauges obsessively. Fuel burn rate, oil pressure, coolant temperature, every needle, every gauge, every instrument was monitored without pause. One B-29 Super Fortress flew ahead of the fighter formation, acting as a navigation aircraft. Its more sophisticated equipment and experienced navigators would guide the Mustangs to their rendezvous point. Fighter pilots followed, maintaining visual contact, trusting their instruments, and hoping their calculations were accurate. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly below. Blue water in every direction, no ships visible, no landmarks whatsoever, nothing but empty ocean for hundreds of miles. Some pilots experienced the psychological phenomenon known as enhanced hearing, imagining engine problems where none existed. Every slight variation in engine tone caused momentary panic. Was that miss in the engine real or imagined? Was fuel consumption slightly higher than planned? Should I turn back now while I still can, or press on and hope everything works out? These thoughts plagued every pilot on that first mission to varying degrees. Hours into the flight, pilots began switching to their fuselage tanks, burning down the most problematic fuel supply first. The 85G behind the cockpit created severe center of gravity issues when full. With all that weight after of the pilot, the Mustang handled poorly, requiring constant back pressure on the stick. The aircraft felt sluggish, unresponsive, and vulnerable with a full fuselage tank. Pilots needed to burn that fuel quickly so they could fight effectively when they reached Tokyo. As the fuselage tanks emptied, the Mustangs gradually returned to their normal handling characteristics that made them such formidable fighters. After 2 hours and 45 minutes, the first landmark appeared on the horizon. The Japanese coast materialized ahead. Mount Fuji rose magnificently in the distance, its snow-covered peak unmistakable even from 50 mi away. Major Van D would later recall seeing the coast of Honshu and old Mount Fujiyama standing out just like it did in pictures. It was an unmistakable landmark. Japan, the enemy homeland, 750 meters from Iwima, the impossible had been achieved. Single-engine American fighters had reached the Japanese home islands. As the Mustangs approached the rendezvous point south of Tokyo, pilots spotted their charges. The B-29 superfortresses of the 73rd Bomb Wing were completing their assembly. A massive formation of 103 heavy bombers stacked from 12,000 FT up to 18,000. The sight was spectacular and terrifying, the largest aircraft in the American inventory. Each B-29 measured over 99 FT long, with a wingspan of 141 FT, and could carry 20,000 lb of bombs. Together, this armada could level entire city blocks. Circling protectively around them were 96 P-51 Mustangs, their polished aluminum surfaces gleaming in the sunlight. The moment the Mustangs crossed the Japanese coastline, pilots reached down and pulled the drop tank release handles. 220 gallons of external fuel fell away from each aircraft, tumbling toward the ocean below. The Mustangs immediately became more responsive, lighter, faster. Now they were fighters again, not fuel tankers. The transformation was dramatic. With drop tanks jettisoned, the P-51D could accelerate to 437 mph and maneuver aggressively. Japanese fighters were about to discover they faced an opponent unlike anything they had encountered before. Japanese radar stations had detected the incoming raid, but what they reported seemed impossible. A massive formation of B-29s was approaching, which had become routine. But accompanying the bombers were dozens of single-engine fighter aircraft. Theradar operators checked their equipment multiple times, assuming malfunction. Single-engine fighters from where? The nearest American carriers were hundreds of miles away. Iwima was under American control, but surely even the Americans could not fly fighters that distance. Yet the radar images were unmistakable. The reports went up the chain of command, each level more skeptical than the last. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai received the scramble order at 10:45 hours. 29 years old, he was one of Japan's most experienced fighter pilots with over 64 confirmed victories. He had been flying since 1938, fighting in China, the Philippines, and throughout the Pacific. He had survived injuries that would have killed most men, including a bullet wound to the head that cost him sight in his right eye. He was elite, experienced, and absolutely confident in his abilities and his aircraft. As he climbed into his Mitsubishi A6M50, Sakai had no reason to doubt Japanese intelligence assessments. American single-engine fighters simply could not reach Tokyo. Whatever was coming must be carrier-based Hellcats or Corsairs. Formidable opponents certainly, but one she had faced before. The Zero Sakai flew was the ultimate evolution of Japan's legendary fighter. The A6M5 Model 52 represented years of incremental improvements to the basic design. It mounted two 20mm cannons and two 13mm machine guns. Its Nakajima Sakai engine produced 130 horsepower, giving the Zero a top speed of approximately 351 mph at 20,000 FTU. Most importantly, it retained the Zero's legendary maneuverability. At low speeds, the Zero could outturn almost any Allied fighter. Japanese pilots had been trained to exploit this advantage since 1940. Get your opponent into a turning fight, use your superior maneuverability, and victory was certain. This doctrine had worked for 3 years. It was about to fail catastrophically. As Sakai climbed through 10,000 FT, he spotted the enemy formation. His eyes widened at the size of the raid. Over 100 B-29s accompanied by what appeared to be nearly 100 fighters. The fighters were definitely single-engine. They were not Hellcats with their characteristic barrel-shaped fuselages. They were not Corsairs with their distinctive gull wings. These were something else entirely. Sleek, streamlined aircraft with bubble canopies and what appeared to be 6 gunwing armament. They flew in disciplined formations at high altitude, moving faster than any American fighter Sakai had previously encountered, and there were so many of them. The Imperial Japanese Army Air Force and Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service had scrambled every available fighter in the Tokyo Defense Zone. Approximately 150 Japanese fighters rose to meet the American raid. Zero certainly, but also Ki-84 Franks, Ki-61 Tonys N1K, and Ki-43 Oscars, to every type of fighter Japan had produced. But by April 1945, Japan's aviation forces were shadows of their former glory. Fuel shortages meant pilots received minimal training. When war began in 1941, Japanese Navy pilots averaged 700 hours of flight time, and Army pilots had 500 hours. By 1945, new pilots graduated with as little as 40 to 70 hours of flight time total. The superbly trained pilots of Pearl Harbor and the early war were dead. Their replacements were barely qualified to flee, much less fight effectively. The first contact occurred at 11:15 hours as American and Japanese fighters merged over Tokyo Bay. What happened next would be described by Japanese pilots as their worst nightmare realized. The American fighters, which Japanese intelligence would soon identify as P-51 Mustangs, possessed performance characteristics that seemed impossible. When Japanese pilots tried to engage, the Mustangs simply accelerated away effortlessly. The P-51's top speed of 437 mph gave Iton 86 mph advantage over the Zero. In aerial combat, this represented the difference between life and death. Zeros that had dominated the skies earlier, in the war now found themselves hopelessly outclassed. Lieutenant Saburo, Sakai made his first attack run on a P-51 that appeared to be flying slightly separated from its formation. He dove from above, using altitude advantage to build speed. As it closed to firing range, he pressed his cannon trigger. The 20mm shells arced through the air and missed completely. The P-51 pilot had seen him coming. Made a slight turn and accelerated. Sakai's Zero, already at maximum speed in the dive, could not keep up. The Mustang simply pulled away, climbing back to altitude with power to spare. Sakai was stunned. He had never encountered an enemy fighter that could outrun him so easily. Across the sky over Tokyo, this scene repeated dozens of times. Japanese pilots would make attack runs, and American pilots would either counter with devastating diving attacks or simply accelerate away to reposition. The P-51's superior speed and power loading gave its pilots options Japanese fighters could not match. Additionally, the Mustang's 650 caliber machine guns, each loaded with over 300 rounds, provided tremendous firepower. Japanese pilots, who had survived battles against Hellcats and Corsairs, reported that the Mustang's guns seemed more accurate, more concentrated, more deadly. The American tactics were brutally effective and had been refined through months of combat experience. Mustang pilots had been trained specifically to counter Japanese maneuverability advantages, never engage in low-speed turning fights where the Zero excels. Use superior speed and power to control engagement timing. Make high-speed slashing attacks. Fire short bursts from optimal range. If the enemy survives, use superior climb rate and speed to reposition for another attack. Never ever slow down and try to turn with a Zero. The tactic worked perfectly. Japanese pilots tried desperately to force turning engagements. American pilots refused to cooperate. Captain Felix Scott of the 46th Fighter Squadron described one engagement that exemplified American tactical superiority. He was down to 15,000 FT when he spotted 3 Zeros below him. He rolled over and dove, building speed to over 400 mph. He selected the trailing Zero and opened fire at 400 WWII. He could see his traces hitting the enemy's left wing and engine. Smoke began pouring out. Instead of trying to turn with the other two, he used his speed to zoom climb back to 20,000 FT. The other Zeros couldn't follow. They were too slow. He repositioned and came back down for another pass. That was when he realized what they had. They had a fighter that could dictate every aspect of combat. They chose when to fight, how to fight, and when to disengage. The Japanese had no answer. Major James Tapp emerged as the star of that first mission. He engaged multiple Japanese fighters, using textbook boom and zoom tactics to claim 4 confirmed victories. His gun camera footage would later be studied extensively by intelligence officers. What it showed was revolutionary. Tapp would approach Japanese formations at high speed, often from above or behind. He would fire a burst from optimal range, typically 300 to 500 WWII hit or miss. He would immediately use his speed advantage to extend away, climb, and reposition. The Japanese fighters never had a chance to return effective fire. They were simply too slow to catch the Mustangs. Over the target area, B-29s encountered heavy anti-aircraft fire, but relatively light fighter opposition. The P-51 escorts had broken up Japanese fighter formations before they could effectively attack the bombers. When Japanese fighters died attempt to attack the B-29s, Mustang pilots would dive to intercept, forcing the Japanese to abort their attacks or face destruction. The escort worked exactly as planned. The bombers completed their mission, dropping hundreds of tons of incendiaries on Tokyo's industrial districts. The air battle over Tokyo lasted approximately 15 minutes of intense combat. When attended, the results spoke volumes about the changing balance of power in the Pacific sky. American pilots claimed 21 Japanese aircraft destroyed with 1 probable and 5 damaged. Japanese anti-aircraft fire and fighters managed to shoot down 2 P-51s. 1 additional pilot was lost when he had to bail out after his aircraft suffered mechanical failure. The exchange ratio was devastating. Over 10 Japanese aircraft lost for every American fighter. Most critically, only 3 B-29 bombers were lost to enemy action, far fewer than typical foreign-escorted raids. The real victory was psychological. Japanese pilots returned to their bases, shaken and demoralized. They reported fighting a new type of American fighter that was faster, more powerful, and apparently capable of reaching Japan from bases 750 minutes freedom away. The implications were staggering. If American fighters could escort bombers all the way to Tokyo, Japan's air defenses were effectively broken. There was no sanctuary, no safe airspace, nowhere to regroup and train new pilots without facing American air superiority. The return flight to Iwima tested pilots as severely as the combat had. They had been in their cockpits for over 6 hours. They were physically and mentally exhausted. Fuel gauges showed disturbing numbers. Some pilots had less than 30 minutes of fuel remaining when they spotted Iwima. The volcanic island, barely visible on the horizon, was the most beautiful sight they had ever seen. One by one, the Mustangs dropped into the landing pattern. Gear down, flaps extended, throttle back, touched down on the rough runway, rolled to a stop, engine shut down. Pilots climbed out on shaking legs, having accomplished what many thought impossible. The ground crews mobbed the returning pilots with questions. How was it? Did you make it to Tokyo? Did you see Mount Fuji? How were the Japanese fighters? What's it like to fly for 8 hours straight? The pilots were too exhausted to answer many questions immediately. They had made history. They had proven that American fighters could escort bombers all the way to the Japanese home islands. These strategic implications would reshape the final months of the Pacific War. But at that moment, all they wanted was food, water, and sleep. Intelligence officers were less interested in pilot comfort than in extracting every detail of the mission. Debriefings began immediately. Each pilot was questioned extensively about fuel consumption, aircraft performance, Japanese fighter tactics, and enemy strength. Gun camera footage was developed and analyzed carefully. Kill claims were verified against multiple witness accounts. The data from that first mission would inform every subsequent operation. The most important finding was simply that it worked. Very long-range fighter escort was feasible. The fuel calculations were accurate. The aircraft performed as designed. Pilots could handle the physical and mental stress of 8-hour missions. The strategic bombing campaign against Japan had just entered a new and more devastating phase. For Japanese military planners, April 7, 1945 marked the beginning of the end of their air defense strategy. The assumption that single-engine American fighters could not reach the home islands had been shattered completely. Within days, Japanese intelligence identified the mysterious new fighters. P-51 Mustangs operating from Iwima. They analyzed captured tactical manuals and interviewed pilots who had encountered P-51s over China and Europe. What they learned was deeply disturbing. The P-51 was not just another American fighter. It was arguably the best fighter aircraft in the world, and it was now flying in strength over Japan. Japanese aircraft designers studied the P-51 specifications and performance with growing despair. The Americans had created a fighter that combined high speed with long range, powerful armament with good maneuverability, advanced technology with reliable operation. The Mustang's Packard Merlin engine was a masterpiece of engineering, producing 195 horsepower at war emergency power. For comparison, the Zier's Nakajima Sakai engine produced only 130 horsepower. The power difference translated into performance advantages across the board. The P-51 was faster, could climb faster, could dive faster, and could fight at higher altitudes than any Japanese fighter in service. The-drop tank technology particularly impressed Japanese engineers. American pilots could fly 750 mi with external fuel, drop the tanks to regain full combat performance, fight over the target. and still have sufficient internal fuel to return home safely. Japanese drop tanks were crude by comparison, often manufactured from thin metal that cracked under stress. They leaked frequently. They created excessive drag. They were in short supply. Japanese fighter range was limited by internal fuel capacity, and internal fuel capacity was limited by aircraft design that had been optimized for maneuverability over range. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai wrote in his diary, after that first encounter, "Today I saw the future and it belongs to America. Their new fighter is superior to our Zero in every measurable way, except low-ED maneuverability, and their tactics prevent us from exploiting that single advantage. They are faster, have more powerful engines, superior firepower, better radios, and most critically, they have unlimited range with their drop tank system. We are defending our homeland with aircraft designed 5 years ago. They are attacking us with the most advanced fighter in the world. Unless something changes dramatically, we cannot win this air war." The strategic implications extended beyond individual aircraft performance. The fact that American fighters could now escort bombers meant that B-29 raids would become more accurate, more concentrated, and far more destructive. Previously, B-29s had to bomb from very high altitude to stay above concentrated anti-aircraft fire and fighter attacks. Accuracy suffered significantly. Now, with fighter escort, bombers could fly lower, bomb more accurately, and complete their missions with acceptable losses. Japanese cities would burn more efficiently. By mid-April 1945, the 2nd and 3rd Fighter Groups had become fully operational on Iwo. The 21st Fighter Group and the 56th Fighter Group joined the 15th Fighter Group, giving 7th Fighter Command over 150 P-51s available for operations. The missions intensified quickly. April 12th saw another major escort mission to Tokyo. April 16th marked the first independent fighter sweep with 57 Mustangs, strafing Koya Airfield in Kyushu. The psychological impact on Japanese forces intensified with each raid. American fighters could appear anywhere, anytime, with little warning. Japanese pilots developed a grudging respect for the Mustang and its pilots. In combat reports and diary entries, they consistently noted the Americans' tactical discipline and superior aircraft performance. The Mustang pilots fight intelligently, one report noted. They refuse to engage in turning combat where we might have advantage. They use their superior speed to dictate engagement terms. They work in coordinated pairs, protecting each other effectively. Their aircraft quality is superior to anything we can field. Our pilots are brave, but bravery cannot overcome such technical disadvantage. The P-51's capabilities were magnified by other American advantages that became increasingly apparent as the campaign progressed. American pilots had superior training. By 1945, new American pilots arrived in combat zones with 300 to 600 hours of flight time and extensive gunnery training. They had trained on modern aircraft with experienced instructors. They understood tactics, formation flying, radio discipline, and emergency procedures thoroughly. Japanese pilots in 1945 had perhaps 40 to 70 hours total flying time. Many had never fired their guns at aerial targets. Some had never practiced combat maneuvers. They were sacrificing young men with minimal training against superbly prepared opponents. American logistical superiority became more evident with each passing week. Iwo's airfields expanded continuously. The Navy CBS worked around the clock, lengthening runways, building hardstands, constructing fuel storage facilities, and creating the infrastructure for sustained operations. Replacement parts arrived regularly on ships. New aircraft flew in from Guam. Maintenance was conducted with proper tools, adequate lighting, and sufficient spare parts. When a P-51 needed an engine change, it happened within 48 hours. Ground crews kept readiness rates above 80% despite the harsh conditions and high operational tempo. Japanese maintenance capabilities had collapsed by 1945. Spare parts were nearly non-existent. Aircraft sat grounded for weeks awaiting simple repairs. Engines failed due to poor quality synthetic oil. Fuel was contaminated with impurities. Airfields lacked proper equipment. Mechanics worked with improvised tools in the open, often under air attack. Japanese readiness rates fell below 40%. For every 3 aircraft on paper, fewer than 2 could actually fly, and those that did fly were increasingly obsolete models maintained past their design life. The quality of Japanese aviation fuel had deteriorated significantly. By 1945, Allied submarine attacks on Japanese tankers and destruction of refineries meant that remaining fuel was often contaminated or of insufficient octane rating. Pilots reported rough running engines, premature failures, and reduced performance. The high-octane fuel needed for maximum engine power was simply unavailable. Japanese fighters were forced to operate with lower performance than their designs intended. American Mustangs, by contrast, ran on 100-octane aviation gasoline delivered by ships that crossed the Pacific with impunity. American pilots could use war emergency power settings that pushed engines to maximum performance. Japanese pilots had to baby their engines just to keep them running. As April turned to May, the tempo of operations from Iwo increased steadily. Escort missions became routine. The Mustangs flew 3 to 4 major missions weekly, weather permitting. Each mission produced more combat footage, more kill claims, more evidence of American air superiority. Japanese losses mounted steadily. By the end of May, the 3 P-51 groups flying from Iwo had claimed over 70 Japanese aircraft destroyed in air combat, with additional dozens damaged or destroyed on the ground during strafing missions. The psychological toll on Japanese pilots became severe. They knew they were outmatched before takeoff. Their aircraft were inferior. Their training was inadequate. Their fuel was contaminated. Their maintenance was poor. Yet they were ordered to engage enemy formations protected by swarms of superior fighters. The result was predictable. Japanese pilot losses accelerated. By late May 1945, the average life expectancy of a new Japanese fighter pilot was measured in missions. Many died on their first combat sortie. The experienced pilots like Saburo Sakai survived through exceptional skill and increasing caution. But even they knew the war was lost. May 29, 1945 brought one of the largest air battles of the Pacific War, over 450. B-29 superfortresses escorted by approximately 100 P-51 Mustangs raided Yokohama in a massive daylight incendiary attack. The Japanese defenders scrambled approximately 150 fighters from all available units. Their assaulting air battle involved over 650 aircraft churning through the sky in a chaotic swirling mass of metal, fire, and smoke. Japanese pilots flew with desperate courage, pressing attacks despite overwhelming odds. One particularly aggressive Japanese pilot shot down Lieutenant Rufus Moore of the 45th Squadron before being shot down himself. Fellow American pilots watched in grudging admiration as the unknown Japanese pilot maneuvered through the escort with apparent impunity before being overwhelmed by numbers. The May 29th mission demonstrated both the capabilities and limitations of the American fighter escort. Despite nearly 100 P-51s protecting the bomber stream, aggressive Japanese pilots managed to damage 175 B-29s and shoot down 5. The American fighters claimed 26 Japanese aircraft destroyed, but the Japanese had proven that courage and determination could still inflict damage even against superior forces. However, the exchange ratio remained heavily in America's favor. Japanese losses were unsustainable. American losses were acceptable. That mathematical reality defined the trajectory of the air. Warda June 1, 1945 became known as Black Friday among the Mustang pilots of WWII. That day illustrated that the greatest danger facing American pilots was not Japanese fighters, but rather the Pacific Ocean itself and the brutal weather that swept across it. P-51 Mustangs launched for an escort mission to Osaka. The weather forecast indicated some clouds, but nothing unmanageable. The reality proved catastrophic approximately 370 mi north of Iwima. The fighter formation encountered a massive weather front extending from sea level to over 23,000. The formation tried to penetrate the towering thunderstorms and was torn apart by violent turbulence. Flying completely blind in extreme turbulence, several P-51s collided with each other. Others were thrown into uncontrollable dives or spins and crashed into the ocean. Some pilots became completely disoriented and flew in random directions until fuel exhaustion. Mustangs were lost that day. 24 pilots died. None were shot down by enemy action. All were killed by weather and the unforgiving Pacific Ocean. The 56th Fighter Group, which had been operational for only 2 weeks, lost 15 aircraft and 12 pilots in a single day. It was one of the worst non-combat disasters of the Pacific War. Black Friday highlighted the reality of very long-range operations. Japanese fighters were dangerous, but statistically they killed few American pilots. Weather, navigation errors, mechanical failures, and fuel exhaustion killed far more. Between April and August 1945, Korean's 7th Fighter Command would lose approximately 180 P-51s in Pacific operations. Fewer than 30 of those losses were directly attributable to Japanese fighters. The rest were operational losses from weather, accidents, mechanical failures, and pilots who simply ran out of fuel and ditched in the ocean. The Pacific was a vast and lethal environment that killed regardless of combat prowess. The rescue services developed to support the very long-range missions became legendary. Submarines positioned along the route to Japan acted as lifeguards, rescuing downed pilots from the water. Destroyer escorts patrolled designated areas. PBY Catalina amphibious aircraft flew search patterns, ready to land on the ocean and pick up downed airmen. The rescue system was remarkably effective. Approximately 60% of pilots who went down in the Pacific during these missions were rescued alive. Lieutenant Frank Ayes of the 15th Fighter Group was rescued twice. The first time he bailed out 430 Mias from Iwima after his P-51 suffered mechanical damage. A destroyer picked him up. Uin won 2 months later, after battling 3 Japanese fighters, Ayes bailed out again. This time he landed so close to a rescue submarine that he did not even have time to inflate his life raft. By July 1945, the character of the air war over Japan had fundamentally changed. Japanese fighter opposition decreased markedly. Many of Japan's remaining aircraft were being held in reserve for the anticipated Allied invasion of the home islands. Japanese leadership had decided to preserve their dwindling air strength for kamikaze attacks against invasion fleets rather than waste them in hopeless air-to-air combat against superior American fighters. This meant that many P-51 missions encountered little or no aerial opposition. The Mustangs increasingly focused on ground attack missions, strafing airfields and industrial targets. The strafing missions proved more dangerous than air combat in some ways. Flying at low altitude through concentrated anti-aircraft fire was terrifying and deadly. Japanese ground gunners became quite effective at leading fast-moving targets. P-51s would sweep across airfields at 350 mph, their 650 caliber machine guns raking parked aircraft and facilities. Anti-aircraft guns would track them, throwing up walls of explosive shells and machine gun fire. Many Mustangs returned to Uoima with battle damage from ground fire. Some did not return at all. Despite the dangers, the strafing campaign was remarkably effective. Between April and August 1945, P-51s from Uoima claimed destruction or damage of over 1,000 Japanese aircraft on the ground. These claims were probably inflated as combat claims typically are, but captured Japanese records confirm that ground attacks devastated their remaining air forces. Aircraft that survived American strafing were often so badly damaged they could never fly again. Japan's already depleted air strength was being methodically destroyed, one airfield at a time. The Japanese response to the P-51 threat evolved through the summer of 1945, but options were severely limited. They could not build fighters with performance equal to the Mustang. Their aircraft industry, pummeled by months of strategic bombing, struggled to produce even obsolete designs. They could not train pilots to American standards because fuel shortages meant training flights were minimal. They could not match American logistics because the submarine blockade had strangled their supply lines. They could not develop effective tactics against an enemy with overwhelming technical advantages. By August 1945, Japan's air defenses had essentially collapsed. On August 10, 1945, the Mustangs of Uoima flew their last major combat mission of World War II. The 15th and 56th Fighter Groups engaged Japanese fighters near Tokyo and claimed 7 victories. 5 days later, Japan surrendered. The war was over. The Mustangs had flown 51 major missions to the Japanese home islands between April 7th and August 15th, 1945. They had escorted hundreds of B-29 missions, conducted dozens of independent fighter sweeps and ground attack sorties, and established complete American air superiority over Japan. The final statistics told the story of air superiority achieved through technological excellence, superior training, and overwhelming industrial capacity. 7 fighter command's P-51s were credited with 206 Japanese aircraft destroyed in air combat between April and August 1945, representing 75% of all Pacific the P-51A aerial victories. The 15th Fighter Group led with 111 confirmed victories. The 21st Fighter Group scored 71. The 56th Fighter Group, despite arriving late and losing heavily in Black Friday, achieved 24 confirmed victories. 5 American pilots became misses while flying from Uoima, including Major James Tapp, who was first to achieve the distinction on April 19th when he downed his 5th Japanese aircraft. American losses totaled approximately 180 P-51s over the 4-month campaign. Of these, fewer than 30 were shot down by Japanese fighters. The rest were operational losses. The exchange ratio in air combat exceeded 7-to-1 in America's favor. Japanese fighters were simply overwhelmed by American performance advantages, tactical superiority, and numerical strength. When Japanese pilots did achieve victories, it was typically through aggressive sacrifice tactics that cost them dearly. For Japanese pilots who survived the war, the memory of encountering P-51 Mustangs over their homeland remained vivid. Decades later, they had been confronted with the stark reality of American technical and industrial superiority. Everything they believed about Japanese martial spirit overcoming material disadvantage was proven false. The Americans had better aircraft, better pilots, better training, better logistics, better tactics, and overwhelming numbers. There was no aspect of air combat where Japan maintained advantage. By August 1945, Saburo Sakai, who survived the war despite his injuries and years of combat, reflected on the P-51 in his post-war memoir. The Mustang was a magnificent aircraft. Fast, powerful, long-ranged, well-armed. When it first appeared over Tokyo, I knew our situation was hopeless. We were defending our homeland with obsolete fighters flown by inexperienced pilots, oozing contaminated fuel, and facing an enemy with unlimited resources. American pilots in their Mustangs could fly 1,500 meters, fight over our cities, and return safely. We could barely fly 200 meters before fuel concerns forced us back. The technological gap was insurmountable. The P-51's strategic impact extended beyond the aircraft itself. The Mustang's appearance over Japan proved that American industrial capacity was unlimited. If Americans could mass-produce a fighter as sophisticated as the P-51, could develop drop tank technology to extend its range, could establish and maintain air bases 1,000 miles from their nearest major logistics hub, and could conduct sustained operations across the Pacific Ocean's vast distances, then clearly there was no limit to what America could accomplish. This realization demoralized Japanese military leadership as much as any battlefield defeat. The comparison between American and Japanese aviation capabilities by mid-1945 was stark and unforgiving. American factories produced 96,318 aircraft in 1944 alone, including over 12,000 P-51 Mustangs. Japanese production in 1944 totaled approximately 28,000 aircraft of all types, and many of these were obsolete designs or produced with such poor quality control they were barely airworthy. By 1945, Japanese production had collapsed under the weight of strategic bombing and resource shortages. Entire factories were destroyed or forced to disperse into caves and tunnels. Quality control became non-existent. Aircraft that rolled off assembly lines often had misaligned parts, substandard materials, and defective systems. American pilot training by 1945 was the most sophisticated military training system ever created. Pilots progressed through primary training, basic training, advanced training, and operational training before joining combat units. They flew multiple aircraft types, learned instrument flying, practiced gunnery on ranges, studied tactics from experienced instructors, and arrived at their squadrons with hundreds of hours of flight time. Japanese pilot training by 1945 consisted of minimal flight time and obsolete trainers, almost no gunnery practice due to ammunition shortages, and minimal instruction from the few surviving experienced pilots. New Japanese pilots were essentially being sent to their deaths with token preparation. The fuel situation epitomized Japan's collapsing industrial capacity. American B-29s and submarines had systematically destroyed Japan's oil refineries and tanker fleet. By mid-1945, Japan had only 8% of the aviation fuel it needed for sustained operations. What fuel existed was often contaminated with impurities that damaged engines. Training flights were canceled, operational flights were minimized. Aircraft sat grounded for lack of fuel while American Mustangs cruised overhead with full tanks. The psychological impact on Japanese personnel was devastating. They possessed aircraft but lacked fuel to fly them. They had pilots but lacked fuel to train them. They had the will to fight but lacked the means. The P-51 Mustang's appearance over Tokyo on April 7, 1945, thus represented more than just another fighter aircraft entering combat. It represented the culmination of American industrial mobilization, the effectiveness of Allied strategy, and the inevitable outcome when unlimited resources confronted limited ones. Every P-51 that flew over Japan carried with it the weight of American factories running 3 shifts, of aluminum mines in Tennessee, of oil fields in Texas, of training bases across the United States, of transport ships crossing the Pacific, of the scientific knowledge that created the Packard Merlin engine, of the engineering genius that developed drop tank technology, Of the tactical innovation that created effective fighter escort doctrine, the Mustang was not just a fighter. It was American industrial civilization concentrated into 11,600 leg of aluminum and steel. Japanese pilots understood this implicitly. When they saw Mustangs circling over Tokyo at 25,000 FT, they saw more than enemy fighters. They saw their own defeat made manifest. They saw that Japan had challenged the world's greatest industrial power and lost. They saw that all the rhetoric about Japanese spirit defeating American materialism was hollow propaganda. Superior spirit could not overcome 80 seat per hour speed differential. Bushido warrior ethos could not match 650 caliber machine guns firing 5,000 rounds per minute. Samurai determination could not extend combat radius by 300 mm. The technical and industrial realities were unforgiving. The psychological impact on Japanese civilians was equally profound, though they lacked the detailed technical knowledge that pilots possessed. They could see American fighters circling overhead with impunity. They understood that if enemy fighters could reach Tokyo, then nowhere in Japan was safe. The carefully constructed propaganda about Japan's defensive strength, about the impossibility of invasion, about the unbreakable home island fortress, all of it crumbled when civilians watched American aircraft overhead day after day without effective opposition. The reality of defeat became impossible to deny. The post-war analysis conducted by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey confirmed what Japanese personnel had experienced firsthand: American air superiority over Japan by summer 1945 was absolute and irreversible. The combination of strategic bombing destroying Japanese production, submarine blockade cutting resources supply, and overwhelming Allied numerical and technical superiority in combat created a situation where Japanese air forces could not meaningfully contest American operations. The P-51's role in establishing this superiority was critical. By providing effective bomber escort, the Mustang enabled devastating bombing campaigns that accelerated Japan's industrial collapse. The irony was that Japan had once produced one of the world's finest fighter aircraft. The Mitsubishi Zero of 1940 was revolutionary, combining unprecedented range with excellent maneuverability and adequate firepower. For 18 months, the Zero dominated Pacific skies. Japanese pilots flying Zeros shot down hundreds of Allied aircraft while suffering minimal losses themselves, but Japan failed to develop successor designs quickly enough. The Zero's airframe was pushed to its limits through various modifications, but fundamentally it remained a 1940 design fighting in 1945. Meanwhile, American aircraft design evolved rapidly. The P-51 Mustang represented 1944 technology with more powerful engines, better metallurgy, superior systems integration, revolutionary drop tank design. The 5-year gap between Zero and Mustang represented the difference between competitive and obsolete. Japan's failure to maintain technological parity reflected deeper strategic and industrial limitations.